Excellent. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another kind of edition of the Geospatial Forum. Welcome to spring 2023. Hope everything's going fine. Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Donal O'Leary. Donal and I actually go back a couple of years, but it's a pleasure to kind of have him back. He was actually big motivation for me to come back to school. So great to have him back and giving a presentation here. Yeah, so Donal got his bachelor's at the University of Colorado, his master's in Western Washington University, and then his PhD at the University of Maryland. Now works with Finite Carbon. He's going to be talking a little bit about so,
Excellent. Thank you so much, Felipe. Hello, everybody. It's really great to be here. I'm honestly quite flattered and humbled to be invited to come give a talk to you all here. This is a really strong department. I actually did quite a lot of research into it when I was chatting with Felipe about good places to go. And I've been certainly very well impressed since I arrived here. I want to say thank you to a short list, non-exhaustive list of folks. Lois, John Volker, who I think is not here today, Ian, Jenna, Rebecca, Rachel, Aaron, Justin, Ross, Anna, Christina, Vashek, and of course, Felipe. You all have made me feel so warmly welcomed here, really included, and it's great to just chat with everybody. And Felipe's been super generous with his time and driving, so I owe you a lot. Thanks a lot. Yeah, it's great to be here. So I am just a couple years out of my PhD. I defended just before COVID broke out, and I technically graduated just after. So it's been like 3 years now. I've been in the work world, post-PhD world. I started in a kind of a semi-governmental organization with Felipe at Neon, and now I work for a fully private kind of industry company. And there's been quite a lot of interest from folks I've been talking to about what are career opportunities in industry? How do you get started in that? Where do you go? What sort of skills do you apply? Is there even value for PhD level skills in industry? And yeah, so this isn't really like a sales pitch on what we do or what I do, but there's a link to my LinkedIn on here. If anybody wants to kind of chat more about that, I'm more than happy to provide some guidance and direction, because I had some friends really help and guide me through that whole process. And I've been very satisfied and feel well respected at my company here. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there at first. So the topic of my talk here today is including family-owned forests in the fight against climate change. I thought this would be kind of a nice provocative title, but I was very quickly corrected by one of my colleagues that it's not just family-owned forests, it's all small landowner forests. So it doesn't really matter if Walmart owns 100 acres out behind their property. Everybody can be included in these marketplaces, but I like to think of the personal touch of the small family-owned forests that are out there. So I'll just give you a brief overview. I'm going to start with some introductions, both to my team and Core Carbon, which is our new product that we're launching the next couple of months here. Then we'll talk mostly about the science, because that's what we're all here to talk about. And then I wanted to touch on data engineering, because that's really where my career has been moving towards in the past couple of years. And I found it to be really super satisfying and kind of validating application of my skill set. So let's start by talking about our team. I'm going to use the word we a whole lot in this presentation, because I don't do anything by myself at this organization. I was really quite isolated in my PhD. I had a fellowship, I had kind of my own funding, and I focused on my own projects, and I hardly ever collaborated with anybody in my office. But here I get to work with this incredibly talented, diverse, and bright group of people. So I want to introduce you to Adam Bausch. He's a remote sensing analyst. Bahari Yakekani is an applied remote sensing scientist. Camille Sete is also an applied remote sensing scientist. That's also my job title. Jordan Golenkov is our senior director, my boss. Mauricio Zapata Cuartas is a forest biometrician. Ninon Becourt is one of our data engineers. Ressa Katami is an applied remote sensing scientist. And Wu Ma is another forest biometrician. So I work very closely with this group every day. Everybody has a master's, a PhD, or both. And we have a very intellectually kind of rigorous and inspiring group of people to converse with as we're working on all these difficult problems. So I'm going to highlight some work from several of my colleagues here, and I've blatantly stolen their PowerPoint slides. So I've got to give them proper respect and credit before we get started. So I work on the research and development team. We didn't even have a name until we started talking about it. And I threw research and development out there because I think that's really what we do. So our mandate is to provide quantification of forest carbon at a high resolution, kind of like Landsat scale-ish or better, and to model forest carbon into the future, both for existing stands and for kind of like replanted, rehabilitated areas. Now, what that ends up looking like comes through in our deliverables. So we help to automate and support the carbon project development process. That's pretty much our main job. We research and develop new products, new skills, new methods to do things. And we produce data products for our stakeholders, either internally or things that we can kind of sell as a forestry company as consulting products to other timber management organizations and things like that. So that's our team and what we do. Let's talk about Core Carbon. So Core is our new product that we're launching right now. It's kind of in a soft launch. It should be totally public in the next couple of months. And what Core is it's a free web-based platform where users can log in, find their property. And if their property is between 40 and 5,000 acres, then they can decide if they want to enroll in a carbon offset project and conserve their forests. It is reviewed and accredited by the American Carbon Registry. So we go through a pretty rigorous peer review process in this to make sure all of our credits are valuable and real. And the automation provided here reduces the transaction cost for every one of these contracts that we sign, which means that these smaller landowners are now kind of cost effective to develop those projects. So people with 100 acres were not previously eligible to participate in this marketplace because it was just too expensive to develop such a small project. But now with the use of remote sensing and some machine learning and things like that, we can open up this marketplace to much smaller landowners. I'll touch on that at the end of this section here. So this is kind of a schematic of what it looks like. We have kind of stratified the forests into various segments of like areas who might have some hardwoods, might have some softwoods, some mix in there. So you can go in and kind of look at the various forests that are on your property. You start to add them together and see what their annual carbon offset kind of monetary benefit would be. And it can give you a bottom line estimate of what your property would be worth in about 15 minutes or less. At that point, once the automation is done, then it goes off to some of our development team who actually put some eyes on it to make sure it's a real project and they're not just trying to sign up a national park or something. But at that point, we feel like we can get our customers pretty intrigued in the first 15 minutes, and hopefully they'll sign up from there. So here's a couple screenshots of what this looks like. I realize this is perhaps a rival up there in Chapel Hill, so please don't kill the messenger, but these are the slides I was given. So you go on and you figure out where are your parcels in space. You pull up your parcel number. Here are several parcels that have been identified. Then on those parcels, you can kind of plot an outline of what are the specific areas of my property that I want to conserve. We're not kind of subdividing any of these lands here, but you can see there's some areas that are forested, some areas that are not, all within this broad outline. Then you kind of click go, and it'll tell you each one of your parcels, how much money it can generate for you on an annual basis. And you can kind of go from there. Now, I've been told to scrub all the numbers out of here because we didn't want to kind of false advertise what it would look like. But I will say in broad terms, the amount of money that can be generated from a plot of land, especially in the Southeastern United States, where we have a lot of carbon and they're really valuable, the amount of money that we can generate is roughly equivalent to the property taxes that are owed for that piece of property. It's somewhere kind of in the ballpark. So for a lot of family-owned lands, this doesn't work.
Sorry.
No worries, Ben. I think my clicker stopped working.
Oh, great. Sorry for
That's
the
okay.
interruption.
That's all right. So I'll just segue into a story. I have a good friend who was my roommate during my PhD. His family owns about 1,200 acres in Kentucky. These are the woods that he grew up in. There we go. Perfect. Thanks for that. And they kind of ran on some hard times, lost some people lost their jobs. They needed to figure out how to get some money to pay for their property taxes. They ended up selling all the timber on about half of their land. And just hearing from Derek, it was just so heartbreaking for him to like go back home and see that this timber company just went in and pillaged their land, the woods he grew up running around in, where he'd go, chase squirrels and stuff like that. So when I started to explain this type of product to him, he became very excited about it. So I think it really does have a nice human impact as well as a monetary and a climate impact that we're going for. So stop working. Sorry, folks. Why don't I just do this? Oh, it's not even. There we go. There we go. Okay, cool. It woke up. I didn't put you all to sleep, but I put the computer to sleep. So there are a lot of lands in the Southeastern United States that are owned by small landowners. State of Idaho is like 70% federal land, but North Carolina has a lot of lands that are going to be opened up to this marketplace with these new innovations. I mentioned the property taxes being a challenge. People like to keep their trees when they can. And beyond just the money and the carbon benefits, there are a lot of ecosystem co-benefits that will happen with these projects going into place. So that's what core carbon looks like. I wanted to give you a kind of an introduction to what our business does, what we're trying to sell, and really like what's the value of science at a company like ours. So now let's talk about the science, because that's what we're going to do. So there's going to be two main examples that I want to talk about in terms of science. We're going to talk about our change detection work and our canopy height modeling. For folks in the forestry world, this is probably super familiar topics to you. For folks who are not, this might be new, so I apologize if I just kind of gloss over things, but there should be plenty of time for questions at the end. I'll be happy to field those as once we get there. But along the way, if you do have a burning question, please go ahead and raise your hand. I might just punt till the end because I have a lot of slides to get through, so I'll try to just do this kind of conversationally. So our change detection work is being driven by our principal investigator, Resika Tami. He has a PhD, did a postdoc before joining us. He's a real pro when it comes to optical remote sensing. So our business has a need for a custom change detection product. There are many on the market right now, but we had some very specific applications that we needed to meet. So our requirements are that we need to be able to create monthly change maps because we have a 6-month reporting period for every carbon project. So if you sign up for one in March, we're going to have to report on it in September, and again the next March, September, and a lot of publicly available products are annual, so they just do not meet that requirement. We also want to detect thinning in addition to canopy disturbances, because if somebody goes in and removes some understory for fire mitigation or to try to make their bigger trees grow bigger, that's removing carbon from the landscape, and that's considered a reversal and a violation of our contract. We also want to detect changes on a pretty small scale. So there's about 5 Landsat pixels per acre, a little bit less. And we want to be able to detect change at sub-acre scale. And we want to monitor all of the forested lands of the United States. So currently, we focus on the US. It's one of the strongest carbon markets in the world. People from around the world are buying these credits. We want to make sure that we maintain the highest quality credits here in the US. So lands that are enrolled in these projects allow very little to zero harvest throughout the duration of the project. These projects are either 40 or 100-year commitments. It's a pretty long time to go without chopping down any of your trees. So we have this, this motto of trust but verify, that we have all of our landowners sign an attestation for every one of these 6-month reporting periods, but we also want to make sure that they're staying honest. And there's also times and places that people just don't know that trees have been disturbed. It might be a tornado goes through, might be an insect outbreak way deep in their back 40 that they just don't get to very often. And then, of course, this is a product that can be applied in other sorts of applications throughout the world of forestry. So a lot of people are curious about change detection work. Several people here are experts in working on it right now. So just really quick, some of the challenges with this change detection work. Don't worry too much about all these numbers. Just wanted to show some back of the envelope math that we're dealing with maybe 1,000 terabytes of raw data before any of the processing or anything gets involved there. So quite a huge scale to work with, which has been a challenge and something I've found really satisfying to try to tackle. And then over here is the Conterminous United States ARD tile. So Landsat has this analysis ready data set where it kind of removes all the overlaps and pre-processes some of the data and stuff for you. So that's the framework we've been working off of for now. There are many hundreds of tiles in this that we'll need to process, but I might be using the term tiles quite a bit here. And you can just see a tile is like maybe a fifth the size of this state of North Carolina. Kind of general scale that we're looking at there. We also, I mentioned kind of the compute challenges, and how we design our compute is also pretty important here. So we need to do things like remove cloud cover and do some pre-processing steps. But when it comes to actually doing the analysis, Reza has really been the driving force in this. But one example I wanted to bring up is that our naive approach is just kind of the first pass of our Python code and how fast we could process some of these tiles. And it was remarkably slow, might take almost a year at the first pass. We started to parallelize things, doing multi-threading and multi-processing, which really sped things up. And then Reza found this great package called Numba, which basically does C compilation of some of the compute before it actually goes to runtime. And that, of course, C is like 100 times faster than Python. So it really, really improved our processing speed. So just kind of touching on the value of computer engineering and data engineering going into these processes right from the ground floor. Ian and I were talking about this earlier, like what's the point of having an in-house product when there are a bunch of available ones in the marketplace? And things like this, we can really, really control the compute down to the highest level of granularity and make sure that our processes are efficient and giving us the answers that we need and that we know we're getting the right answers for the right reasons. So I can't exactly, is that, no. I can't spell all the beans. I can't tell you exactly how we're doing these things, according to our lawyers who I listen to. But the way we're doing it is kind of tracking a time series of pixels. So here we're looking at NDVI, which is kind of a measure of greenness. And you would expect greenness to go down dramatically if there was a clear cut. So what we're seeing here is there's kind of a routine. You see kind of a regular signal in the NDVI over seasons. And we're looking for anything that starts to deviate from what we expect to see. Again, I can't say exactly how we do it, but you're all real smart people. You can probably figure it out. And so what we're seeing here is there's a pretty substantial change that occurs in late 2017, where the NDVI is going up, and then all of a sudden it just drops below where we've ever seen it in the previous couple of years. We can see those really align. So these red dots here are the center pixel of a window of 9 we're looking at. The blue dots are kind of the surrounding pixels. So you can see these are, when they're right on top of each other, it's a pretty homogeneous shot right there. And we can see there's very clearly some sort of disturbance. So here's the NDVI and these 5 images across the top, undisturbed. Down at the bottom, it's nice and bright pink. You can tell the NDVI dropped dramatically. Something happened there. And I lost it again. Cool. So now you can see this picture on the top left was pre-disturbance. Picture on the top right, this whole area has clearly been disturbed right there. We're able to identify that pretty easily. Again, this is about the most basic example you can think of with a giant clear cut from a plantation, but this is where we started with first principles. So just kind of a comparison here. So what we have on the left is the finite carbon model. On the right, NLCD, National Land Cover Dataset, which we just kind of took a before and after something that was forest and is no longer forest and called them disturbed in the yellow. So what we can see here is kind of several features. So there's a big clear cut kind of on the top right side, popped right out for both methods. The finite carbon method is kind of subpar, not as good as the NLCD over here. And that's something that we're working on. We think is really sparse forest, maybe changed a little bit. Maybe they did some thinning, we can't quite tell. But it seems like the finite carbon model also identified a patch of thinning over here that the NLCD model, at least it called it forest before and after. That's probably true, but we're really interested in any change to the forest at all that might impact the carbon that's on the ground there. It seems like there has been a fair amount of thinning that we were able to capture with our model. So this is undergoing really active development right now, but we're making some good headway on it. And I'm happy to see the progress with our change detection work thus far. And I would say Rez has been leading it. I've been maybe the number 2 person on this project, and certainly helping with a lot of the compute and infrastructure, which I'll touch on. So that's talking about change detection. Let's talk about the canopy height modeling. So we have, got my slides out of order. This is being led by Camille Sette, who also had a PhD and a postdoc for coming into this. And she's done some extremely relevant research, which I'll touch on. So we have a business need for really good canopy height models. There are canopy height models out there. They don't meet all of our needs. So we need these at least an annual basis, because every year we re-stratify the forests for our project areas. And we just want to know basically which pixels we should lump together into these groups. We also have a need to resolve very tall trees. So imagine over on the West Coast, we got some redwoods, and a lot of the canopy height models that are available today saturate above maybe 60 or 70 feet, maybe 100 feet, and they just don't give any resolution there. But those are our most valuable customers, the ones with the really big trees. So we want to be able to resolve those. We want a flexible design to accommodate a variety of inputs. So right now we have JEDI, which is a LiDAR instrument that's on the International Space Station. That was supposed to be kicked off and burnt in the atmosphere like a year ago, but they let it continue kind of as a part of COVID. But that's going to be sunset in the near future, and we need to be able to accommodate other instruments that might be coming online, or even a lack of spaceborne LiDAR for some time. We're just kind of restricted to ISAT-2, which isn't a great instrument for this sort of work. And we need to monitor all of the forested lands of the conterminous United States, which you can do very well with JEDI, fortunately. So it needs to be every year, we can't saturate, and it needs to be scalable. So for maybe the non-foresters in the group, like, why would you want to estimate canopy height? So it's basically the #1 predictor of carbon for trees. How tall they are is pretty much your first metric you're interested in. Taller trees have more carbon. We use this as one of our inputs to stratify forests into like groups for our core methodology. If you want to read more about the core methodology, it is publicly available on the American Carbon Registry website, and I can direct you there if you're curious. You can also use this to detect forest disturbance. Probably not the greatest way to do that, but if trees go from really tall to really small, you know this problem. And also, this could be really valuable for monitoring forest restoration. One of the hardest things to do is quantify how carbon is accruing for, say, like a farmland that's being converted back into a forest. If we want to be able to monitor, model, and essentially sell those carbon credits, we need to be able to track them very effectively. So I'm going to go through a quick kind of schematic of how you would set up this sort of project. So you would, let me just kind of walk through the various steps here. We're going to start with field data and ALS. ALS stands for airborne laser scanning. So basically LiDAR that's collected from an airplane. You can start with that and use that to compare with a spaceborne instrument like JEDI to calibrate those JEDI data to make sure that they're giving you reliable height estimates compared to what you know is there on the ground. Once you have those calibrated JEDI data, you can pair those with continuous satellite data. So your JEDI data are kind of sparse, but those will be your training points. Then you have gridded raster data like NDVI, basically whatever remotely sensed observations that you want to kind of squeeze into this machine learning model so that you have coverage of the entire area that you're interested in. You pair those together with some machine learning. Folks who know a lot about machine learning know that there's a lot of similarities between these various things. And I think there's a lot of hair splitting where it doesn't really need to be. So I just say machine learning in general. We'll crunch it with a big model and produce some canopy height maps. That's kind of schematic. I'm going to go through a couple of these steps here, hopefully catch your interest. So this is Camille. She grew up in Brazil and loves Ontario, playing in the snow and everything now. She's such a joy to have on our team. And she wrote a paper about this. So this paper was just published like a couple months ago, really lays out in detail how they accomplished this in Canada, where she did her postdoc. Now she's doing it in the US. So again, I can't spill all the beans, but there's basically every detail you might be interested in this paper here. So let's start talking about the field data and the ALS. Felipe, do you see where I'm going with this? We're going to talk about neon. Okay, so this is where Felipe and I used to work together. They have really excellent field sites around the country where they take all sorts of great observations related to a variety of ecological variables. Their forestry observations are really, really good. So they have some of the most advanced hyperspectral imagers in the world. They have really good LiDAR instruments, field observations, the whole nine. So we start with neon data to get a great sense of our, like, what does these forests look like on the ground? So here's a point cloud. I'm kind of animating here. So this is a 1 kilometer chunk of the Wind River Experimental Forest in Washington State, really tall trees, a lot of interesting things going on the ground. So this is being colored by absolute elevation for each point. So those trees in the top left aren't necessarily taller, they're just up a hill slope. You also have a couple interesting artifacts here where you have this really kind of conspicuous quarter of a pizza shape slice here where they did a clear cut, left some trees standing there. There's this interesting thing right here. Does anybody want to tell me what this is right here? Yes, riparian buffer. Exactly. You can't cut trees down around rivers. I knew someone would just get that right. Thank you. So this makes for a really interesting study area because there's all sorts of different things going on this plot here. This is kind of realistically colorized point cloud. But what I'm doing here is throwing down a bunch of squares on top of it. This is where Neon has these field plots with really detailed measurements of what's going on in the forest. So we're going to dig into a couple of these field plots here and learn more about it. So here is a point cloud from just one of those little squares. You can see some really tall trees there. It's kind of hard to resolve the little trees going on underneath. Now we're looking at it from the top down, not a complete canopy forest. We like to do this to get a sense of what's going on the ground in these areas. But again, we know, like, okay, there's probably some Doug fir, some spruce, Western hemlock, things like that in this area, but we don't know exactly which is which. So you pair that with Neon's field plots. What I've done here is thrown circles around trees. The diameter of the circle is proportional to the DBH, the diameter at breast height, which is basically how big the trunk is. Different colors or different species. And now you can really start to see much better, like, what are these little trees going on in the understory? We know there's a bunch of little trees there. And those are not only important for carbon, but also for like the growth of carbon into the future. Because if you don't have a bunch of little trees, that stand is not really going to continue to grow very well in the future. So we can get a much better understanding of what's going on at the plot level. Now let's talk about how we compare that with JEDI data. So JEDI are shot from the International Space Station. It's a pretty big footprint. So here's JEDI up on the ISS, 25-meter diameter footprint of what it's capturing there. These are straight out of the kind of original JEDI paper. It's a waveform instrument. So it shoots down one big pulse and gets kind of a big return pulse back. This is what it would look like for a forest with kind of a decent canopy, a little bit of understory growth. That's what the ground looks like, that ground pulse. And this is kind of what you would expect to capture, maybe a dozen trees inside of a JEDI footprint. So I'm going to lay the tract of a JEDI orbit across this site here. You can see it intersects a bunch of these different kind of tree forest types. And let's take a closer look at it. So this is just the point cloud from within a JEDI shot here. Nice little circle. Again, colorized by elevation. So the red is the top of the tree. We're looking down from the top of the tree right now and kind of get a good sense of what's going on in the forest. Now we can plot that side by side with a JEDI waveform to really take a look. Okay, is this ground pulse where we think the ground is? Is the top of the return actually capturing the very tops of these trees? When you have these really kind of conical or X-current trees, you know, the LiDAR doesn't always get the very top of them very well, but a waveform does a bit better than like individual pulses, like a standard airborne LiDAR would. So there's a lot of things we can do to kind of match these up, compare them, make sure that the JEDI waveform is giving us good information. And we can even further kind of fit some models to these two to see, okay, do we need to offset JEDI by a little bit, plus or minus, to make sure that we're getting appropriate height measurements? You can do these for a whole bunch of them. I think this one's really interesting because like JEDI wasn't listening in time to get the whole return pulse and it kind of missed the top of the tree there. And what happens in this area of regeneration if you get just like part of a tree from the side of it? Really start to understand that these data are not, they're definitely not going to be flawless. There's a lot of kind of caveats we need to keep in mind as we're working through this. I bring this up because this was actually really challenging to pair up these two data sets. So I wrote a tutorial about how to do this. I put it on my LinkedIn here. So please take a look at that if you're curious about working with these data sets. definitely feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. We'll connect. I'd be happy to tell you anything I can to help you on your way. But I would say LinkedIn was the #1 tool I used to kind of transition into private industry. And it's incredibly effective. I get recruiters messaging me all the time now. It's a good tool. So machine learning, again, I'm going to be kind of vague about this because there's a lot of details I could talk about, but if you know someone or you yourself know how to set up a machine learning model, you can probably figure this out. This is what it looked like for them in Canada. So setting up, these are the JEDI samples. They had a bunch of ISAT2 samples as well. You get these gridded information. You can put in ecological information, topographic information, NDVI, anything you can think of, throw it into a machine learning model and get some canopy height maps. So look at these beautiful canopy height maps all across Canada. I'm super proud of Camille and the work that they did here. I'm really excited. Pretty much at this point of the process for our work that we're doing at Finite for all of CONUS. And I think we're going to end up with some really, really good products. And I can't wait to implement them in our work because I think it's going to make it much better. All right, so breezing right through that. We talked about what and why we do. We talked about the science some. Now I want to spend a little bit of time touching on the data engineering side of things, because this is not something I expected in my career. I have always been focusing on remote sensing. I really love looking at pixels, looking at maps of the world from the top down. And I have also always been really curious about kind of the compute side of things. How do you scale things up? As a geographer, I like to say I'm really interested in questions of scale. And I think it's interesting to get a really great answer for a very small area, but I'm way more curious about, what if it looks like this here, what does it look like over in California or up in Maine? Like, what are the differences between these places? We really can't perform that sort of analysis without having a really well-defined data engineering kind of system in place to allow us to scale up. So thinking about these problems, first of all, like working to the point where I needed them really helped me identify what I should have been doing from the beginning to make it much easier by the time I got to the end. I heard this really great saying that it was true for me, that doing a PhD is like doing a group project, except that the person who has no idea what they're doing was just me 3 years ago. So knowing kind of where to start from and what to do from the beginning has been really helpful. So as we're defining these data engineering routines, this has been where I think I've been making a big impact, kind of knowing where we need to go. And then as we're hiring new team members or people are taking on new projects, working with them very closely from the beginning to make sure that they're doing things like setting up their Python environments in a flexible way and using versions of Linux containers that are going to be updated and not some kind of shady third-party add-ons and things like that. So as I've been learning about this, I feel like it's been really improving our compute. And the last thing I want to mention about it before diving in is that I think it's also been a really good move for my professional development. So I was chatting with Ross earlier about the value of geographers in industry and in kind of career spaces. And I understand you all don't have maybe necessarily like a geography department here, but a lot of what you do is very interdisciplinary and really bringing in information from various places. And I think that has a tremendous amount of strength, not only in being able to communicate with various inputs, stakeholders, and people who are interested in contributing to these projects, but it also really like, it sets one in the middle in a really good way. So I feel like by focusing a lot on the data engineering things, I'm able to contribute to our change detection and our canopy height modeling and stuff. But at some point, everyone sends their information to me to kind of put into the pipelines and do the compute. So I think not only, like, I love being in that position because I like being a generalist and drawing from a broad set of skills. I think it's also going to set me up well in my professional career because being kind of the center for a lot of that stuff means I'm also communicating with these different parties. And I think basically I'm like angling for a promotion into kind of a leadership role. And I think that's a natural place for a leader as someone who's already kind of in the middle and in charge of a lot of product creation and kind of product vetting. So I might be the last person who touches these products before we send them off to other parties. So I just kind of want to throw that out there because it's something that occurred to me last night, actually. I thought it might be interesting to share. So let's talk about data engineering. So we have some specific requirements for a compute environment. First of all, it must be secure. I'm not really going to talk about that anymore because compute security is like a years-long topic in and of itself. But some other things I think will really resonate here is it should be very repeatable, well-documented, scalable, and efficient. So in terms of the security, I think that speaks for itself. Now, it really needs to be repeatable and well-documented because, as some of you all know, the forest carbon marketplace and world is under pretty intense scrutiny. I think it's a good thing overall, don't get me wrong, but there are articles and newspaper outlets. John Oliver focused on some carbon market things. There have been some companies that have been subject to some pretty big layoffs because what they were trying to do didn't really work. And so there's a lot of scrutiny. And basically, we're trying to build into every one of our products, every one of our projects, we're trying to build in this almost like a self-documenting way to know exactly what happened, what version of GeoPandas were we using, which version of this canopy height map were we using as an input, because we're anticipating 5 to 10 years from now being audited on at least one of these projects. We can be guaranteed of that. So everything needs to be really watertight and not necessarily perfect. We can't ensure that they're perfect, but we want to be able to explain what went wrong if something did. We want to be able to scale our compute as high as we can possibly go globally using thousands of terabytes worth of data. And that requires a really solid data engineering plan. And we want to do some level of automation for our job processing. I'll touch on this a little bit later here. But we have certain things we want to do every day, like scrape Landsat and pull the latest Landsat data. We have some things that we want to do in response to other projects. So once the Landsat data are downloaded, we can run our models again. So how do you kind of trigger those things moving forward? When I think back to my work in grad school and my contributions to papers, I did everything I could to do it right once. And then once I had those files, I backed them up in 6 different places, and then I wrote up the paper and submitted it. And again, there was a few things, a few like snow data products that I would do maybe annually, but it was always just kind of like, oh, I'll find a weekend to do that. Much better if you can just automate it. So I just want to touch on Docker here really quickly. Who here has heard of Docker? Awesome. Who here works with Docker on a regular basis? Excellent. Cool. Yeah. Okay. So for those of you who aren't super familiar with Docker, Docker is a way to take all of your kind of dependencies and an operating system in your code and save it all in, I like to think of it as like a snapshot. And if you have code that works right now, you want to take a snapshot of it so that 6 months from now, if something breaks, you can at least revert back to this previous version. Docker is really good at that. So these, sorry, this font is so small. I didn't realize that on my tiny laptop screen. But these images can be used to make containers that will actually kind of run your code. And the nice thing about these is that you can save a Linux operating system with very specific Python environment into this container and run it on whatever server you want to. And it's agnostic to what platform it's running on, for the most part. So we run stuff on Google Cloud. You could do it on AWS. You could do it on your local on-prem cluster. You can do it on your laptop. It's all going to act the same in these containers, which is great. So we like to make purpose-built containers to do a very specific thing. So I had that example earlier of downloading Landsat data. So for one of our containers, you might have all the code in there that says, log into the USGS servers using these credentials, download all the data, et cetera. But you could have like a variable or parameter in there that just says Kentucky. Okay, so this container, all it's listening for is Kentucky, and then it knows what to do. Once you have a container that will do the thing, I just kind of touched on this. Oh, those went out of order, but you can do the thing with those parameters, either passing the state name or something. And just worth mentioning one more time for anybody who's wrestled with Anaconda or pip or anything to get Python environments behaving correctly. This is another way that, like, once you get it working once, you can just save it. You don't have to worry about subsequent updates breaking your pipeline. So now let's talk about Kubernetes. Okay, who here works or who has heard of Kubernetes? Yes, so way more than I thought. And do people work with Kubernetes on a regular basis? Yeah, a little bit. What's your application?
I actually work for NVIDIA. So
That's awesome. Yeah, and clearly familiar with the power of high-end processors, HPC. That's cool. GPUs. Nice. Yeah, we haven't quite gotten to that point, but I've done a little bit of computer vision, and like the power of NVIDIA's amazing. Cool. Cool. So okay, so I can talk a little bit more about this then. Kubernetes is what we call kind of like an orchestrator for these Docker containers. So it not only provides a platform to create clusters or virtual clusters, which you may be familiar with. I like to think about clusters as just kind of like 1 to n laptops that are all talking to each other, virtual machines, more or less. And at Finite Carbon, we use Kubernetes to manage our large batch processes. So if we have, like the task I was just describing, we want to download all the Landsat data for a state. First, we would make what I call a loader. And here I will say I, because I really built this infrastructure for our team. So we have a loader, which kind of creates a list of tasks. It might just look at a shapefile and be like, what are all the state names? Okay, we have 48 states. Now we're going to pass each one of those state names to a work queue, which manages kind of those tasks. Not only does it distribute those tasks, but it also makes sure that they actually get done. And then we have our processor or our workers. So each one of these little green boxes here is a Docker container. You could also think of it as maybe like a virtual machine, kind of analogously. And the work queue will then pass each one of these items to each one of our workers, and they can all start processing. So with Google Cloud, they make it really easy to just spin up as many of these as you need. I put a little asterisk on there because the cluster can scale up dynamically, which is nice. So if you have, there are some processes that we don't need done very fast. We can just start it at night and it'll be done in the morning. So we can just have one worker. There are some processes that maybe we have a really business critical decision that we need to make tomorrow, and we have 10 days worth of processing that we have to do. So we can spin up 20 nodes and do it all in 12 hours so that when our VPs are ready tomorrow morning, I can hand them the information that they need. So these can be expensive, but when there are big decisions being made, it's worth the investment. It's nice here. Okay, so last highlight I want to talk about. Ninon Becourt is our data engineer, and she's really been leading the charge on this automated job scheduling, and she's hilarious. She used wingdings. Apparently, this is not part of this slide. I don't know how this happened. Good one, Ninon. You really got me there. So she's saying, do you feel like Sisyphus? Is this you? Are you constantly scraping data from the internet? Are you constantly rerunning your models with new data? Are you constantly reparameterizing things? And do you feel like you've been punished by Zeus for all of eternity? Well, worry no more, because Airflow's got you back. Okay, so if you're dealing with tedious tasks or things that need to just be repeated a lot, I get pretty fast with like clicking this box, Alt-Tab, go to here, do this, but it's like truly a waste of time. So we've really been digging into Airflow a lot more recently, which allows you to programmatically write up these workflows, such as downloading a bunch of Landsat data, and you save them in what we call DAGs, which is a directed acyclic graph. So Wingdings says, what is a DAG? So a DAG defines this workflow. You write it up in a Python script. There are templates you can work off of. It's not super complicated. And you can do things like run bash commands. So for me, I use the bash commands to launch Docker containers, run processes, initiate Kubernetes, and get our workflows kind of running. So one example workflow would be to launch Kubernetes cluster. Then we need to pull down some secrets to authenticate to our resources so we can get our data off of the storage. We can get some information out of our databases and kind of go from there. We'll run these containers to completion. And then we have some code that makes sure everything was actually completed right. And at that time, so during this time, the cluster will scale dynamically. And once tasks are completed, we'll release those resources and stop paying for that virtual machine to a fraction of a second. And then once everything's done, we don't just want the cluster sitting there idle because that's also expensive. So one of the nice parts about my job is they really tell me to focus on the outcomes and then worry about the money later. And so this is, fortunately, I'm at the point where things are mature enough that we're really starting to optimize the cost of things. So you can do things like use lower performance clusters that don't have GPUs if you're doing less intensive processing and things like that. So that's part of what I'm focusing on. Might seem kind of boring, but it does end up being kind of 6 figures worth of outcome at the end of the year. So here's a little diagram of what that might look like. So this is kind of what your DAG would look like. This is basically just a Python script that says to do these things. This is a Kubernetes cluster up here in the top section. And so you will kind of start the DAG. It'll create the Kubernetes cluster. It'll pull your authentication, start to do the thing. And then whenever it's done with that, it will scale down, finish, close up all those resources. And the best part is you don't have to touch it. So these run for us at midnight. They're usually done by like 3 a.m. And I never see it. I never touch it. It just works. So it took maybe a year worth of engineering to get there because none of us were really data engineers to start. But this is eventually where we got to. So it's nice to have all these things just kind of in your back pocket. You can focus more on the things that really matter. I can spend more time thinking about the science of remote sensing, a little less time about Docker. So our current state of play for this is that we do have data sources updating every day. We have some of our models are running every day, producing new products on a daily basis, which is great because we never really know when someone's going to ask for them. They don't have to ask us anymore. We can just tell them they're up to date because you can see the timestamp where it's stored. And right now we're working on some kind of alerting mechanisms. First thing is when we have failed jobs, kind of devising a way to let us know that jobs have failed. And very soon we should start having some kind of automated, we're like maybe a couple weeks out from this. For our change detection work, we can automatically detect if there's been a change on one of our properties. We can know what area, how much area has been disturbed, and we'll send an email with a little PDF or maybe like an HTML link to our development team and be like, hey, you folks probably want to look at this. We think something's going on here. We'll have a whole stack of satellite images so they can look through and just be like, oh, it was between January 7th and January 10th, something happened. And then maybe they can call up the landowner and see what's going on. So that is just kind of, I think, a nice example of how we're delivering value to our business using a very scientific kind of mindset and perspective on this. So a couple of things I'd like you to take away from here. We are a private business, but I think we do actually perform cutting edge research and development in remote sensing, forest biometrics. I didn't really touch on that because I don't really work with the biometricians all that closely, but they're hugely influential. Mauricio and Wu are total geniuses. And I really like that we're opening up the forest carbon world to these smaller landowners, corporate or family-owned farms or forests rather. So I think we get a lot of input that they want to be a part of the solution, but don't know how to yet. So I think that's coming in the next couple of months. And just touching on again why I enjoy the data engineering side of things. I love scaling up as a geographer. It's something I'm really curious about. I'm continuing to learn new things, go to different conferences, learn about Linux, things I never had thought about before. I like that I'm central to this data product creation. And I still get my hands in all the interesting science, but I feel like I don't deal with the tedium of debugging tiny little issues. I get to think about kind of some of the big picture things and contribute to all of those. So that is all the time I want to use for that. Again, thank you all so much for having me here, for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. I'd love to answer some questions that you have. Thank you. I see a question over here. Your hand raised.
Yes. Thank you for this presentation. It was really great to learn about your company and the work that you all do. I actually have two questions for you. When I saw the promotion for this for like small family-owned farms, I was not expecting 40 acres to be the minimum. So why was that the selection for the minimum of this process?
Was your expectation smaller?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very good question. That is what they've determined at this point is still kind of economically viable for us to interact with. There's a fair amount of overhead for each individual project. We need to do the contracting, we need to communicate with these folks, we need to cut the checks, we need to write the contracts. And I think anything smaller than 40 acres is the juice isn't worth the squeeze, as they say. There's just not that much money in it.
Yeah, I understand that from a business perspective. So I guess from a climate, I think a lot about including Black landowners into the conversation about carbon credits and getting them into the, I guess, making them more aware and getting them into the climate movement. And so I guess do you know of any options, or like how do we involve landowners who have less than 40 acres into this conversation? And what are, I don't know, because like their land is valuable, they are valuable. So like, how do we bring them into the conversation?
I really like this question. I think it's very important. I don't have a great answer for you. I wish I knew more about it. I had a really good conversation with your department head, Aaron, earlier today about a concept of landowners kind of aggregating their lands together. And there are opportunities to perform kind of co-op groups that can then sign up for these offsets contracts. I understand there's quite a bit of kind of political resistance to the idea of community organization and almost as like a socialism coming to get you kind of thing. So I think there is some resistance to that in some ways, but we do have some examples of successful projects where multiple landowners have joined together to get over the threshold to make a carbon project. Those projects were before this core methodology was implemented. So they must have been, I actually don't know the sizes of like all the individual property owners, but I do think there is an opportunity for that. But I'll admit, I hadn't really thought about it from a social justice perspective. So I'm going to write this down and bring this to some of our development team members and see what they have to say.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And then my second question was related to the length of the contract. You said 40 to 100-year contracts. Is that what you said?
Correct.
So I was wondering what happens in the event that, like you were saying, the land is harvested, or like they have a pest infestation and things need to be removed, or what happens in the event of a natural disaster, like trees are knocked down because of hurricanes. How does that impact the contract, and what are the consequences to the landowner, or what happens if like that land changes ownership during the time period of the contract?
Yeah, these are really good questions. Easiest one I'll pick off first. The encumbrance to the land, that commitment to not harvest, is basically applied to the title of the land and will transfer with transfer of ownership. So if you sell that land, that encumbrance stays with it. There are some land purchasers who are interested in that because you also get the payments then. The payments occur semi-annually, so every 6 months. And so if you buy a land that has a carbon development on it, you will get those paychecks, which may go up as the price of carbon changes. So there's some kind of speculative investment in that regard. And then the question about disturbances. This is not my area of expertise, but I'll do my best while still being accurate. About 20% of every project is put into a buffer pool. So if you have 100 units, offset units on your land, you'll only end up getting paid for like 80 of those because 20% needs to go into this buffer pool. That's for every project at every scale. So even our really big projects that we've been developing for years. Occasionally there are big disturbances. Specifically, wildfires in the West is the one we're really concerned about. And we have seen that impact some of our projects. I don't know what the threshold is to the point where the the project goes up in smoke, if you will, where it needs to be canceled. So there is some threshold at which the project will be terminated. And then I don't really know what the economic fallout is from there. It's not like the landowner needs to pay everything back. That's not part of it. I think it's much more likely that our business is kind of on the hook for some of that. Again, I can't speak to that exactly, but so the big picture, we do try to anticipate and offset some of these disturbances that might happen. But when they do happen, I think there's kind of a gradient. There's some little disturbances will just be okay. Some maybe we pay them less for a certain amount of time. And then there's the worst case scenario where the project just needs to be scrapped completely. And all of those carbon credits are kind of released from the market. They don't exist anymore. That's my understanding. There's some of my colleagues could answer that much better. Do my best. Thanks for your great question.
So here, circle back.
I've got a question about spatial scales and how they interact with how credits are calculated, I guess. So my understanding is that for tracts that are involved, just conservation, not planting of trees, they calculate the number of available credits by comparing the estimated carbon storage and future carbon storage on the particular parcel to a baseline, a local baseline of some kind. And those local baselines are usually calculated at a pretty broad spatial scale. So they might include a bunch of different ecosystem types over a county or series of counties or bioregion or something. Isn't there kind of a mismatch that occurs there when you have really small parcels, 40-acre parcels that might have just one ecotype that might mismatch pretty heavily with the baseline for the region that you're calculating against? Doesn't that give you a pretty substantial, but is that something you think about? And how do you account for that, I guess is my question.
That's a great question. It's really difficult. This is something we wrestle with a lot. And we kind of, think about, there are so many aspects of our business that are aggregated at really large scales. So we use forest inventory and analysis data, FIA data, when they have plots all over the place. But then you just kind of run into this problem that an average at broad scales is going to be wrong at every single specific place by some degree. So that in terms of the baseline measurement, I don't actually know all the details that go into that. My understanding of basically, this is something that came up. We had quite a lot of back and forth with the American Carbon Registry when we were under peer review for our new methodology that you can go down to 40 acres, small landholder methodology. And basically the agreement that we came to is that every project's going to be a little bit wrong, some more than others. On aggregate, it should come out pretty much right. So I think there is a fairly broad tolerance for some of the projects, and we do the best that we can. But we just know that there's some degree that we're going to be off. And this is also something I was chatting with Aaron about earlier today, is that in hindsight's 2020, and we'll retrospectively kind of look at some of these projects and be like, oh, this one was really bad, or we paid this person too much or not enough. I think the important part is that we do something today to deal with climate change. And signing up all these forests to be conserved is something I would rather do now. And if we get some of the details wrong, worst case scenario, there's hundreds of thousands of acres of forest being conserved. So that's what helps me sleep well at night. I wish I could speak in a little more detail to the question.
I guess that the base match, the baseline mismatch is kind of a given because you've got different spatial scales. It's always going to happen.
Yeah.
Do you have any accountability to make sure that baseline mismatch is always coming out even? Have you seen the carbon plan paper about baseline mismatch? There was a global change biology paper about it.
No, I haven't seen this.
Might be worth looking into.
Totally.
They found that it doesn't really come out in the wash. That usually it works out in favor of the banking companies.
Okay.
So
yeah.
Whenever there's a mismatch, they're selecting parcels where the mismatch favors the creating more credits than in a particular parcel than the like average for the area.
I see. That's a good point.
So I guess I was curious if your company had any accountability to make sure that that's like that, where you have mismatch, that areas with high mismatch and low mismatch are balancing each other.
This project is so new that we haven't signed up like a whole lot of people yet
Right.
to do this. We're using kind of an older, more standardized methodology for the really big projects we already have developed. And I know that they do account for that in those projects that are, much bigger. I don't have a great answer for you, but I would like to kind of like assure you that the folks I work with are some of the most credible people I've ever worked with. And we do frequently acknowledge biases in our work and work to eliminate them. I don't think there's ever been a conversation where we're like, oh, there's a couple different ways we can do this. And like, this one's really a whole lot better for us. Everybody in the room is like, what's the science? Let's get this right. So that, that's, I think that is also one of the challenges with working in industry. It's like, I do so many things that we're trying to do things quickly and not let perfect get in the way of good. But in doing so, everything we do is imperfect to some degree.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, it was great questions. Thank you.
We're out of time, so maybe if you want to get with Donal and follow up with some questions. I'm sure you'll be.
Yeah, totally. I'm happy to stick around.
So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.